Have you ever felt like life was quietly slipping through your fingers, like the world around you was moving, but you were stuck in a moment you couldn't escape? This is a story about love, loss, and the unexpected moments that change everything. Stay with me, because this one might just change the way you see your own life. It happened in the kitchen on a quiet Thursday afternoon. I was standing on my tiptoes, reaching for the top shelf of the cabinet, rearranging dishes that hadn't been touched in years. The faint hum of the radio filled the space, one of those easy listening stations I'd always kept on for company. It was supposed to be a simple task, one of the dozens I used to fill the quiet spaces in my day. Then Evan walked in. I didn't hear him at first. His steps were quiet, deliberate, the way they always were. I only noticed him when I turned to grab the next stack of plates and saw him leaning casually against the counter, his arms crossed, a small smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice warm, teasing. "I'm fine," I said quickly, too quickly, my cheeks flushing as I realized how flustered I sounded. He stepped closer, reaching past me for the glass on the shelf above my head. The movement was smooth, natural, but it brought him so close that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the earthy warmth of the rain outside. "Here," he said, handing me the glass, his voice quieter now. "Thanks," I murmured, but my voice faltered, my breath catching as his hand brushed against mine. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The air between us shifted, charged with something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. His eyes met mine, and the look in them made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a glance, it was searching, deliberate, like he was seeing something in me that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. I stepped back, breaking the moment, and turned quickly to set the glass on the counter. My heart was pounding, and I hated how obvious it felt. "You've been busy," he said, his tone easy as he leaned against the counter. "It keeps me out of trouble," I replied, forcing a smile. "Trouble?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "You don't strike me as the troublemaking type." I laughed, the sound more nervous than I intended. "Not anymore, at least." He didn't say anything, just watched me with that same faint smirk, his gaze steady in a way that made my pulse quicken. Evan had only been living with me for a month, but his presence in the house had already turned my carefully curated world upside down. When my husband Richard passed away 6 years ago, I'd spent the first few years drowning in the quiet. The house had been too big, too empty, and I'd filled it with routines and distractions. Gardening, cooking, cleaning, anything to keep myself from thinking too much. It worked for a while, but then Evan came back. He'd called one evening out of the blue, his voice hesitant as he explained his situation. His tech job in Seattle had fallen through, his lease was up, and he needed a place to land for a while until he figured out his next steps. I could still remember the way he'd paused after asking, as though he were afraid I might say no. The next morning, the storm was gone, leaving the world outside fresh and quiet. The sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, glinting off the rain-soaked garden, and for a moment, everything felt strangely normal. But as I stood at the sink, rinsing my coffee cup, the weight of the night before settled heavily on me. My reflection in the window was as familiar as always, but there was something different about the woman staring back at me. Something softer, something unsure, I had crossed a line, and though I didn't regret it, I couldn't ignore the questions clawing at the edges of my mind. What happens now? I didn't hear him come into the room, but I felt his presence before I turned around. Evan was standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his t-shirt slightly wrinkled. He looked younger in the morning light, less guarded, and for a moment I let myself just take him in. "Morning," he said softly, his voice careful. "Morning," I replied, setting the cup down and wiping my hands on a dish towel. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we hadn't said yet. He stepped further into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he were testing the waters. "Did you sleep?" he asked, his tone gentle. I nodded, though the truth was, I wasn't sure how much of the night I'd actually spent sleeping. "Did you?" "Not much," he admitted, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He moved to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee before leaning against it, his gaze fixed on me. "Are you okay?" The question was simple, but it carried so much weight, and I felt my chest tighten under the pressure of it. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice trembling slightly. He nodded, as though he'd expected that answer. "That's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to figure everything out right now." His words were a relief, and I felt some of the tension ease from my shoulders. "Last night," I began, but the words caught in my throat. "Was real," he finished for me, his voice firm but kind. I looked up at him, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "It's not that simple, Evan." "I know," he said, stepping closer, "but it doesn't mean it wasn't real." He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine where it rested on the counter. The touch was soft, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers curl around his, the warmth of his hand grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to know," he said gently. "We'll figure it out together." His words made my chest ache, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. "This is scary," I whispered. "I know," he said, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand. "But you don't have to do it alone." We stood there in the quiet, the sunlight streaming through the window, the sound of the world outside, distant and muffled. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace, a fragile, tentative kind of hope that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone in. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Sometimes the moments that scare us the most are the ones that change us for the better. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Long Life Wisdom for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the beauty in life's unexpected turns.